Hi, everybody. Welcome to class. We're going to talk about nuclear strategy today. But it's not just going to be about the strategy. That's where we're going to begin with this. But it's also going to be the question of, given the best strategies we can come up with how to use nuclear weapons, the next question becomes, do these strategies work? And if they don't, either A, do we change the strategies? But we'll talk about that a little bit. But even more than that, if they don't work, then should we keep relying on nuclear weapons? In other words, should we start talking about the other side of the equation, which is disarmament or denuclearization of a single country or the world or whatever? I mean, clearly we talk about trying to make sure nuclear weapons don't fall into the hands of countries like Iran and North Korea, or what we call nuclear proliferation. We don't want proliferation, more countries to get nuclear weapons. That's a very common thing we talk about. What we don't often talk about is that other side of, at least anymore, at least since the end of the Cold War, should we get rid of nuclear weapons? This will be part of the conversation we have today. It's going to be fairly, I mean, again, in just a few slides, we're going to talk about nuclear weapons and all that kind of stuff. And we're not really going to get some great answers, but hopefully the beginnings of some questions that you guys can continue in this class and throughout your life. So here we go. Let's talk about the Cold War. So this first video here is going to be about the Cold War, and then the second one's going to be about how we talk about nuclear weapons today. In fact, the big thing I want to talk about the Cold War is how do we get, like, before there's nuclear weapons, like there's no nuclear weapons, and all of a sudden we have nuclear weapons and strategies. There's a transition there where we try to figure out, well, what are we going to do with these things and how are we going to use them? And that's what I want to talk about, is that transition in the late 40s, early and 50s, where we hadn't quite settled on exactly what this is. The Soviet Union was getting nuclear weapons at this time. It was a little bit of a mess. So we're going to start here with, we're going to just fast forward to 1954. John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and he comes up with this, again, we have nuclear weapons. We've had them for like 10 years now. The Soviets have gotten nuclear weapons. So now there's this conversation about, well, what are we going to do with these things? How are they going to be used? And he comes up with this called the New Look. And this becomes policy for a while. And the whole thing revolves around this idea here, massive retaliation as a deterrent. If we say to, for example, the Soviet Union, hey, if you do something we don't like, we're going to just start dropping nuclear weapons all over the place on you. Massive retaliation. So you do something like, for example, if you use nuclear weapons on us, we're going to drop all of our nuclear weapons on you. Massively retaliate. And the idea there being that if we're going to do this and they believe that we're going to do this, then they won't do that thing in the first place. It's a deterrent. Deterrent only works if you never have to use it's essentially, you say, don't do this or else. And a deterrent only works if you never have to use the or else. The or else is so bad and it's so believable that I don't even want to toy around with it. That's the whole idea, is massive retaliation as a deterrent. For this to be the case, nuclear weapons have to be seen the same as any other weapon. Now, if I talk to you guys today and I said, if I showed you a tank and I showed you so if I showed you a bow and arrow, I showed you a tank, and I showed you a nuclear weapon, you would definitely say, the bow and arrow can kill, the tank is way more powerful, and then the nuclear weapon is way more powerful than that. Here's the problem, though, is tanks, bows and arrows, they all kind of fit in the same category, what we call conventional weapons. So we sort of see these as weapons that can be used in war. Obviously, the tank is more effective than the bow and arrow, but still, it's kind of the same thing. It's just all fighting like that. We tend to put nuclear weapons in a different category. Again, they are weapons of mass destruction. They are weapons, sure, but if I drop a nuke, let's say, here's a nuclear weapon. I know I'm not doing this very well, but just work with me here. Let's say it's a 10 megaton. I don't making these terms up here. Megaton, 10 megaton bomb. Now let's say, so I drop one nuke that's a 10 megaton bomb, or I come along and I drop, maybe 1,000 bombs, just regular bombs out of airplanes that equal 10 megatons. There's a sense in which this one would be seen as more okay than this one. Now that we have a better understanding about sort of the after effects of nuclear weapons and radiation and suffering and all that kind of stuff, they're not seen as equivalents. But at this time, the only way this is going to work is if we don't think of it as something very weird to do, but nuclear weapons are just ordinary weapons. They're the same as any other weapon. And that becomes sort of U.S. policies to say nuclear weapons aren't something different. They're just another kind of weapon we have. And if that is the case, if the U.S. sees it that way, then there's a real credibility that we'll use them. If we see them as something different, odd, unusual, there's less credibility that will actually pull the trigger on those. So this becomes a very important part of this policy here. And then another term that comes along with this is the idea of brinksmanship, which is don't test us. That we will get all the way up to the brink of war. Don't push us on this. And that's what's going to happen, actually, end up in the Cold War. There's going to be times where things start escalating. It's called brinksmanship, where it's getting up to the brink of war, the brink of nuclear attack, and you don't want to cross that line. Great. Here's one of the reasons why this becomes the policy. There may be some great military reasons, but the real reason is a political reason, is that it's really expensive to stay armed constantly against the Soviet Union. And the United States is needing money for other things. Economic growth and wants to spend money on things. It doesn't want to spend money on a standing army, on a lot of troops. It doesn't want to spend money on new tanks and all this kind of stuff. Nuclear weapons are a really cheap alternative. If you're going to operate them like this, they're actually really cheap. Yes, nuclear weapons are expensive, but just think of how much power you get out of one nuclear weapon versus how many tanks, how many airplanes, how many people you have to have manning those things to pull off 10 megatons worth of damage. Nuclear weapons are pretty cheap. So this is a way to sort of have deterrence on the cheap. But this only works if all this works. Great. Okay, so that's sort of the policy in the 1950s. There is some pushback, and let's talk about the pushback here. It's this guy, Henry Kissinger, who's going to end up becoming the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor under Nixon, but that's late 60s. For now, he's a professor at Harvard, and he's saying, I'm not feeling that whole thing about the massive retaliation, and here's why. You can say all you want that nuclear weapons are just another weapon, but honestly, nobody's really buying that. And just, I mean, look at Eisenhower. Eisenhower's such a nice guy. I mean, he's grandfather, all this kind of stuff. And you come to him and you say, hey, you know what? Somebody just did something to the United States. I need you to authorize the use of all nuclear weapons being dropped on Russia, killing millions and millions and millions of people. Is Eisenhower going to do that? And that becomes one of these conversations about, is that really is massive retaliation really credible? Because if it's not a deterrent. So massive retaliation is not very credible, so it's not a deterrent. It's not doing what you think it's doing. So we needed a different policy, is what he's going to argue. He's going to say, what's more credible? How do we have nuclear weapons and use them in a more credible way? He's going to say, instead of having these huge nukes that we're going to wipe out whole populations, we should be focusing on building small nukes, or what they call the terminology that becomes as tactical nuclear weapons. These are more like nuclear weapons that would, say, blow up small areas, like again, very, very powerful bombs, but not as powerful as, say, taking out a whole city. And so they're used in limited ways for limited objectives. Not trying to sort of, as this sort of massive deterrence, because that's just not a very realistic thing. But say, for example, if the Soviets cross over into, say, Germany, we will use these on, the military troops that are coming across. We won't blow up Moscow, but we'll blow up those army corps, things like that. And then, of course, the argument then goes, another reason why that we're not going to use massive retaliation is because we just don't want to kill so many civilians. That's just super weird. It just seems weird. So, but armed forces today, they're just not as dependent on supply lines. We don't really, the total war of World War II has already sort of given way to other ways of thinking about this. And so this is going to work, Kissinger says, because we're going to be dropping these small nukes on military targets, not on civilian targets, which means it's more likely that we're going to actually do it, which makes it more of a deterrent than, say, we'll kill everyone if that's the case. Does that make sense to you guys, how important that sort of idea of the credibility of the deterrence is? I sometimes use this example in my classes. I say, look, if you guys cheat in class, then I am going to chop off your hands. And there's a sense in which you'd say, yeah, that's really a very powerful, painful punishment. But I don't think you're going to do it, so it doesn't actually keep me from cheating. Whereas if I say, if you do this, I'm going to give you an F in class. That's not as severe as chopping off someone's hands, and at the same time, that actually makes it seem more likely that I will do it. And so that acts more as a deterrent than, say, the more strenuous thing. Okay, so that is Kissinger. Now, that's Kissinger's position. Does it take off? And the answer is, well, there's a bunch of critics of this position. Just as Kissinger was critical of the new look, there's critics of Kissinger. The number one critic, in fact, if you ever want to sort of, the first place you should always look whenever you're looking at policies that are being presented and then people critiquing them. Usually the first people that critique a policy are the people that stand to lose economically or prestige or whatever because of that policy. And if we think about this, who stands to lose from this policy? It actually is the Air Force. The Air Force is probably the first critic out there because the Air Force is the branch of the military in charge of nuclear weapons. So under the new look, we're putting almost all of our military budget into nuclear weapons, which means we're putting almost all of our military budget into the Air Force. The Air Force is becoming the dominant military branch. And they're not that happy about any talk that would not be the case anymore. So the Air Force is saying, no, that's not a good plan. Great. Other critics are going to say, it's unlikely cities and civilians would really be spared. I mean, it's nice of you to say your whole argument, Kissinger, is super interesting and all that, but it's very unlikely that it will stop at just, that again, we won't bomb these other cities for other reasons. And I'll talk about that here in a second. The tactics that are suggested by limited war are flawed. So let's think this through. So we sort of, if we take Kissinger's idea and we think this through, it turns out that the logical conclusion, if we actually play this game out, is that if we use tactical nukes, small nuclear weapons instead of massive retaliation, it turns out that there's a high likelihood that they'll be used early, and they'll be used because you want to use them in their territory. So let's just draw a little map here. Here is, again, I'm going to oversimplify this. This is going to be Western Europe over here. So we're just going to say here's Paris, okay? And over here is Moscow. There's my nice, simple map of the world. Okay, so here's how this sort of works. So let's say that I know that I'm the Soviet Union, okay, and I know that the United States is going to has tactical nukes and it's going to use them. So what do I do with my military units out here? Well, I want to put these military units in a way where the tactical nukes can't wipe them out, number one, and number two, even better, is the United States will think twice about dropping a tactical nuke. And so there's a couple things that I can do. The first thing I can do is I can take my units, and instead of having this big sort of army, I will disperse my army. I'll take this and I'll break it up in a bunch of different places. So if you're going to get it, you've got to drop a lot of tactical nukes to pull that off. The other thing, they have to move quickly. So if they're constantly on the move and they move quickly, it's going to be a lot harder to target. We don't have the smart weapons yet. So it's going to be harder to sort of drop the tactical nuke on them. Okay, that's the first thing that's going to happen. Now, because they move so fast, here's what we're going to do. The very first day of the war, in fact, the first minute of the war, these guys are going to get in their cars and they're driving to Paris. And it's going to be what we call a hugging technique. Is the Soviet military, is what they're going to do is they're going to go as fast as they can to get to the cities on the other side. So here's Paris, maybe here's, I don't know what's on this side, Berlin. You're gonna just sort of move to those cities. And here's why. Because now if you hit me with your tactical nuke, you've hit your own cities. So you've not only killed us, which is bad, but you've killed civilians of your allies, which really undermines the whole thing. So far more likely is once we're near Paris, you're not going to drop a tactical nuke on us at all. So it actually gives me an incentive to get to Paris before you ever start arming those tactical nukes. That's called the hugging technique. And so what this means is, if I'm the United States, now let's flash over to the United States, and I know that that's what they're going to do, if these are going to work, they're only going to work if I hit them while they're in their territory before they even move. So before this happens, you attack them first and you attack them early. And here's the logical conclusion of this, because of the strategies this sort of creates, is that if we follow Kissinger's limited war doctrine, it actually ends up with increased likelihood of preemptive nuclear strikes, that we need to hit them before they even think about running to Paris. And so all of a sudden, you've really changed sort of the dynamic of the whole thing. Is instead of it being a deterrent, it actually turns out to be the limited limited war doctrine actually ends up being something that actually increases the likelihood of war. And we end up with this, limited war actually increases the likelihood of nuclear war. Because now once we have an incentive to fire on them quickly and ahead of time, they have an incentive to fire their bigger missiles back, and we fire our bigger missiles back, and we're right back in nuclear war again. So and because that's the end result, that everyone dies, it actually turns out that limited war is no more credible than massive retaliation. You haven't gained anything. You're right back where you started with. Few people on the battlefield will survive. You're just going to be dropping these tactical nukes all over the place. It's just going to make the battlefield itself just a hot mess. But also it'll make, that'll very quickly end up hitting cities as well. Forces would end up being kept near cities. And so if you're going to take out those forces, you have to take out those cities, and then you're back where you started again. So the end result of this, and it's one of those ironies here, is that after these conversations, after these debates, and by the way, good marks for Kissinger. By 1960, even Kissinger opposes limited war. He says, "Wow, I was wrong. That was not a good plan. We're done with that." The result of all this sort of strategy debate back and forth is you end up sort of at the same place that you kind of started, which is massive retaliation, or what comes to be known as this right here, MAD, mutually assured destruction. If you do anything to us, we're going to blow you up entirely. And if you do anything to us, we're going to blow you up entirely. So anybody who does something to the other side sets off a chain reaction that ends up with both sides being eliminated. Everyone dead. And which means that, when this is working properly, nobody does anything to either side. And instead of having a Cold War, you end up with a long peace, because neither side wants to tempt fate and end up with a humanity-ending, species-ending nuclear war. All right, that's the Cold War. That's where we end up. We still have this today. Mutually assured destruction is still nothing better has come up since then. Let's just say that. So that's where we're sort of at today. So when we come back, we're going to talk about how we are doing this today.